It's 5:15 and we have a quorum. And so I call us to order. As a result of an executive order by Governor Pritzker suspending in-person attendance requirements for public meetings, Human Services Committee members and city staff will be participating in this meeting remotely. So could someone make a motion to suspend the rules to allow us to conduct our meeting remotely using Zoom software?
I move.
A second.
Thank you. And I think we're supposed to have a roll call. Hello, Alderman Braithwaite. Welcome.
Good evening. Sorry for being late.
Not a problem. We're just getting started. So I think we need a roll call from whomever is doing that for us this evening.
Okay. Alderman, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay. Alderman Revvy?
Aye.
Alderman Fleming?
Aye.
Alderman Fisk?
Aye.
Alderman Braithwaite?
Aye.
And Alderman Rusiman is not here yet, correct?
Great. Okay. Thank you. So our first order of business is public comment. And per our council rules for standing committees, it provides that each speaker shall have up to 2 minutes for comments. And we have about nine speakers ready to talk to us this evening. So first, Mike Vasilko.
Why did I think we had 3 minutes? No, just 2 minutes?
Standing committees is 2 minutes. Well, P&D is 3 minutes.
I see. Okay, so I'll ask again, where is there any evidence that the Evanston Police Department committed any questionable act of violence towards Evanston residents, like the deaths, what I would call the murders, in Baltimore, Atlanta, Chicago, Kenosha, Minneapolis? The Evanston Police Department are head and shoulders above any of these other police departments. It is absolutely a fair budget discussion to have about additional crisis intervention by mental health professionals, but not at the cost of defaming the Evanston Police Department and its officers. The last presentation I saw was at the Second Ward meeting with Alderman Braithwaite, where a group presented, and they stated at that time that they want the funding initially and later to abolish the Evanston Police Department. News reports recently say that this group wants 75% defunding, which I find to be absurd. Most reports I've read about CAHOOT's effort, which is, I think, the effort that you've been following, say that mental health crisis staff still need to be accompanied by or must call for police support because CAHOOT's staff cannot detain anyone and they are not trained to intervene if a situation becomes violent. Meaning crisis intervention staff are in addition to, not in lieu of, police or fire department support. The majority of the handful of cities that are experimenting with the CAHOOT style intervention did so only after a citywide vote. So if Evanston is going to consider this, then we need a referendum. And the referendum would need to present all of the facts that deal with what some claim are some kind of savings, which I don't think there are going to be any savings. Either way, it needs to be a referendum by the city in its entirety. I've not yet received, by the way, Alderman Braithwaite, a copy of the Second Ward meeting that you had said was being recorded. I'm not sure what the delay is there, but it's been almost 2 weeks. Chief Cook should be commended for the comprehensive EPD update in the packet. My only question is, when will comparable budget discussion memos be forthcoming from all other city departments? Solving the city's huge budget problems cannot fall on the backs of the Evanston Police Department. Adding new social services in the form of crisis intervention sounds like a good idea, a good program. as long as all of Evanston voters get the opportunity to vote on it. The cost of the program needs to come from reductions in all department budgets and without tax increases. Lastly, I don't agree with, there was some mention of a $500, there was some mention of giving police or crisis intervention staff discretion to waive crimes for stealing up to $500. I mean, I don't agree with that. And if it is something where some people are going to be excused from stealing up to $500, then I think everybody should be excused from that crime. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Betsy Wilson.
Thank you, Chairwoman Revvy. I appreciate all of your efforts, and I know that the committee has been working hard on this, and I'd like to thank you all again for all of the time and diligence you've spent on this issue. I did want to address a couple comments from the end of the last committee meeting. One concerned some anxiety on the speed at which we're moving. I hope that, I'm sure that you all have already read the Evanston Fights for Black Lives report. And I hope that you also found some comfort in the diligence and details that they provide. I think it provides the committee and the council a fantastic blueprint for going forward at a speed that reflects the urgency of the situation. I think they also did a great job of addressing the need for significant reimagination of the way we ensure public safety. I also heard Chief Cook express some concern about how the police budget is thin. But I also wanted to point out to the committee, I'm sure you all have also heard Chief Cook say over and over again that the Evanston Police Department follows the mandate that it's given by the people of Evanston. And I think one of the points of this process, one of the underlying impetuses for this process is that we're simply asking the police to do far too much. And as Chief Cook points out, if we reduce their mandate, they have to do less, they need fewer resources. We've seen, for instance, my daughter was out past curfew last week and I got a phone call from the police and had a conversation with them about how they're spending their time enforcing curfew for teenagers. And we all agree that that's not what we want our police budget to go for, that there are ways to provide for safety and the safety of my children and our community's children that don't involve the police. We talked about we have as a group talked about other aspects of the police department's current responsibility that simply don't need to be there. Things like insurance reports for the benefit of insurance companies, things like a large portion of traffic enforcement doesn't need to take place from the police, things like animal control. There's all sorts of lower level tasks that can simply be taken off Chief Cook's plate. And the money that's used to perform those tasks can be used more efficiently in other entities. I also wanted to point out in response to Mr. Basilco's comments that, we also heard from social workers. I'm thinking particularly of the social worker who works for the Moran Center, who has an extensive experience in the criminal law system. And she tells us that this is a role that social workers are equipped to take, that they don't need to be buddies to police officers, that they're equipped, trained, and experienced in handling crisis intervention situations themselves. So I thank you again for your time and for letting me speak this evening. I wanted to express one more time my deep admiration for the work that Evanston Fights for Black Lives has done in producing the excellent report, and I hope that we as a community can follow their recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Melissa Blount.
I think she's not here, Eleanor. She says she was.
Okay, okay, Barbara James. I did see Barbara, so there we go.
Good evening. There's been a lot of talk about defunding the police, but as we know, in anything like this, the devil is in the details. And how, do we just defunding the police and cutting their budget doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We've got to have maybe improvements need to be made, but that needs to be done thoughtfully and thoroughly so we get it right. And you just don't take a sword to a slice of bread, as some people have argued. And I think we need to proceed very thoughtfully and think of alternative ways to accomplish some of the goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen Courtright.
Hi, I want to thank you all for your dedication in addressing these issues. I appreciate all the work that you're putting into it. You won't be able to accomplish everything that might be done in a single upcoming budget, but it's extremely important that that by the decisions you make, you strongly signal the city manager, the police chief, and police leadership that the intention of the city is to make structural changes that will bring about changes in how individual officers are held accountable for the unprofessional, disrespectful, racially insensitive, or worse behaviors that are inconsistent with our values. Maybe no one has been killed, but I don't think lack of death, is the standard we should be holding our police officers to. Today, the chief apologized to 2 young men who were mistreated terribly by police, traumatizing them. It was an excellent gesture, and I'm glad that he did it. And it's a shame that it came so late and was not done by our previous police chief and city manager. I have a lot of admiration for Chief Cook, and I know that there are many, many good police officers at EPD. But having a good chief in this moment does not obviate the need for ordinances and policies that are permanent. And having many, many good police officers does not obviate the need to hold the other kind accountable. A recent analysis of use of force incidents in 2019 and 2020 year-to-date shows that 5 officers are responsible for 40% of the use of force reports that were filed. I hope that you will question some of the things that you hear from city staff and EPD. I think it's important that Evanston police officers are fully engaged in the community and have asked for several years now how we can incentivize officers for living in Evanston. I've analyzed salary data for patrol, traffic, detective, and other non-leadership roles of police officers for the last 2 years. The average is around $100,000, which is significantly more than the average income of Evanston according to the U.S. Census American Family Survey of 2018. Also, the Hilliard-Hines study is often brought up, but in fact that study was narrowed so greatly and so much of the analysis was done by the police department for budget reasons that it makes the usefulness of assessing staffing and the size very weak indeed. I congratulate the chief for reducing the size of our department by attrition. And while we're on this topic, I hope that you will not let the voices of privileged white members of our community and their perception of whether policing is good, bad, good enough, sufficient, insufficient, outweigh the important voices of people in the marginalized communities who tell us, and we know from data, that they are arrested more often, they are traffic stopped more often, they are searched more often, and they are on the receiving end of use of force more often. 80% of use of force is against Black people in Evanston. One last thing. I hope that you will, in the coming weeks and months, pay attention to the way citizen complaints are reported to you. While transparency is theoretically improved in the new Citizen Police Commission, there's no real oversight or influence that this group can bring to bear. And you know that because you formed the ordinance. You and the city manager are the only ones outside of the police department who can hold our police accountable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Darlene Cannon is next.
Yes. Hi. Thank you. Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back while walking away from the police. His 3 children were in the car and witnessed the entire ordeal. What his children witnessed will traumatize them for the rest of their lives. Black folks are tired of the violence that is being brought onto Black bodies by the police. Black lives do matter and deserve to be respected, and we deserve to live. But more than that, we need justice for every Black man and woman that has suffered, bled, and died at the hands of racist cops and those who do not value our lives. We need justice, and we want it now. Justice in Evanston comes in the form of reallocating of funds. You keep touting the equity lens model while you, as a council, spent $800,000 on trees. It's about standing up for what is morally right and addressing the needs of this community and its most vulnerable residents. When young adults protest outside EPD and use chalk that washes away with water, they shouldn't be threatened with arrest, nor should a Black woman be asked by a Black officer, where are your Black friends? Black folks didn't create this oppressive, violent system. White folks did. Therefore, whites are the ones who are given the task of dismantling it. You as an officer don't get to choose who gets to show up to protest. We're demanding the defunding of all oppressive regimes, including the Evanston Police Department. Justice cannot wait. Thank you.
Thank you. Carla Sutton.
Alderman Revvy, I'm not sure Mr. Sutton is on the call.
Okay, alrighty, we'll go ahead then. Sean Peck Collier.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. Good evening, older people of the Human Services Committee. Before anything else, I want to give condolences, well wishes, and peace to Jacob Blake's family. What they've gone through is unforgivable, and I want to take a moment of silence for them. Okay. To the point of this committee, I want to thank Alderwoman Fleming and Alderwoman Revvy for trying to make last week's meeting move forward in a productive way. Alderman Braithwaite, last meeting, I saw you were in and out of the meeting. Nevertheless, you did not speak up. I hope today you will join Alderwoman Fleming, Simmons, and Revvy in making actual progress in what you as a committee have been tasked to do. And according to grassroots organizers in Evanston, agreed to do. I want to mention, what you decide today, we as a community will promise to hold you accountable. Alderwoman Judy Fisk, in the last 2 meetings, you protested that you have a lack of knowledge of what your constituents in the First Ward and the residents of Evanston mean when we ask for the police to be defunded. Even as you listen to the potential alternative services and the funds would go to, you have pretended ignorance. You have invoked fear and continue to make the false correlation between police and safety. I want to echo those who have come before me and those that are with us here today. The police do not keep Black and marginalized communities safe. The purpose of these meetings are to determine how we can replace incompetent police with alternative crisis response programs. More importantly, since you sit on the committee for reparations, you should be able to see how this is a necessary step in eradicating systemic racism. You are being disingenuous. More than a month ago, Evanston Fight for Black Lives reached out for an opportunity to discuss the matter with you. You never responded. When they later held a sit-in during a council meeting, you never came out to speak with them. When Alderman Braithwaite was gracious enough to explain in detail what it meant, you did not listen. When your own first residents emailed you, you rebuffed them. This morning at Haggerty's Police and Q&A, a tiny sample of the trauma Evanston's police department has inflicted on the Black and brown youth of our city. No apology was ever made to them until now. He has never made an effort to repair their trauma. There's so many other examples of violence at the hands of Evanston police that will never make it to this level of public discourse. And it is the purposeful erasure of those stories which ensures violence is systemic, as opposed to a few isolated incidents. Police violence is perpetual, consistent, and in concert with other oppressive systems like education, housing, and employment. Now, one means of ensuring the wrongs of our city are repaired is for our internal review process, where the police police the police, and our appointed citizen review board, which only has the power to recommend discipline but cannot guarantee justice, to be replaced with an independent, democratically elected board of citizens to oversee the police and be given the power to administer discipline and reparations when necessary. Another is by decreasing the need for police response by creating a new city department that responds to the thousands of calls that fall into vagrancy, mental and behavioral health crisis calls, or well-being and premise checks. Last week, we heard from many nonprofit agencies that are models for some of these services. Cahoots is another. It serves both Oregon cities of Eugene and Springfield, and yet only costs $2 million between the two. This is just one alternative department, and each year it saves the city of Eugene alone over $8 million and over $15 million additional dollars in ambulance service and emergency room hospital costs. Creating a department like Cahoots to respond to mental health and nonviolent crisis calls is not only ethical, it's fiscally responsible. Now, everyone can agree that it's the alderperson's job to protect and amplify the voice and bodies of their constituents. It is the council's job to do what is best for the citizens of their city. Alderman Fisk, you aren't doing the work, and you aren't doing your job. If you refuse to contribute in a positive and productive way in this conversation, in this committee, the best thing you can do for the city is to get out of the way for people who are. Thank you.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Betty Ester, if she's on the call.
Okay, good evening. Sorry about that.
Okay, welcome.
I have to figure out how to unmute myself to talk to you. This evening, I have a statement that I will give to you from the Citizens Network of Protection. And it's basically, on June the 10th, 2019, the Evanston City Council voted unanimously to adopt a resolution affirming the city commitment to end structural racism and achieve racial equity. In adopting the resolution, the Evanston City Council acknowledged its own history of racial motivated police motivated policies and practice, and made a commitment to collaborate with residents to pursue policies and take action to ensure civil and human rights to all individuals. Nearly 14 months later, despite a numerous approval of council resolution, the Evanston Police Department continued policies and practice reminiscent of those which for decades have harmed the Black residents of Evanston. I'm here with a recommendation that will allow the City Council to update its June 2019 promise to our residents, that the council pass an ordinance for a fully empowered, independent civilian police oversight board, not one handpicked by the mayor or council, but democratically one chosen directly by the people of Evanston themselves. This is not a new concept, but one that Evanston residents of the Citizen Network of Protection, CNP, have been pursuing this endeavor for more than a decade. What would a fully empowered, independent, voted, chosen civil oversight board mean for the people of Evanston? It would mean direct democratic community control of the Evanston Police Department. It would mean that Evanston City citizens, through their elected committee, would make recommendation on the police budget and police policy. It would mean, for example, that the people of Evanston could decide to limit the scope of police operation to addressing conflict and harm. It could reallocate funds outside the scope of the under-resourced human resource and other city departments to implement our public health and quality of life, to improve our public health and quality of life. The people through its vote elected oversight committee would be empowered to study and analyze trends and patterns related to the Evanston Police Department officers, and to launch investigation into department members who may demonstrated a practice of misconduct, racial bias, and or non-compliance with police department policy. The committee would have the power to both fire and hire and have complete independence from law enforcement and mayoral control. Evanston City Council passed reparation and made the nation realize they can do better. We set the example. Now you have another opportunity to set the example for the rest of America, to show your trust, to show you trust your citizens to decide who police and how we are policed. A fully empowered independent board, policy board, such as the one for which the Citizen Network of Protection have been advocating for over a decade, would mark another historical moment in Evanston history and show that the city of Evanston is truly committed to addressing systematic racism in policing, not just through words written in a resolution, but through practice and action. George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Bernard Taylor, Jacob Blake, every one of us knows these is a systematic problem. I call on the members of the City Council to fully fulfill its promise of the June 2010, June the 10th, 2019, to show the political will to take action. And also would like to say I want to thank Bessie Wilson and Karen Cartwright for their comments. They are on target as to things that we do need here in Evanston. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alderman Revell, Mr. Sutton has joined.
Okay. Okay. Carla Sutton. So, Mr. Sutton, do you want to give your remarks? You're muted.
Audio. Oh, there it is. About time. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Mainly, I just want to reinforce the statements that have been made previously and to emphasize the need in this community for an independent review or a police review board as explained by the members of the CNP and other members of the city. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And Alderman Morell, we had two late additions to public speakers. We had Ms. Doreen Price and Mr. Adam Marquardt.
Okay. So, Doreen, you want to go ahead? We're ready.
Okay. Oh, there I am. Sorry. Thank you very much. Yes, I submitted mine in writing, and thank you for allowing it. I was like a little bit after 5 o'clock, so I'm going to say thank you for that. So mine has to do relating with Carlos and Betty and others have said about the speakers before, and it has to do with grassroots efforts and the ability to speak with the marginalized people who are being most affected, and a lot of us are very much removed from that. And I think, Eleanor, you and what this committee is trying to do is understand that better. And in that regard, I commend you. In terms of the process, sometimes it's not always clear, but as we go through this and you incorporate what the citizens are telling you, I think you're going to go in the right direction in terms of what people are asking and what they need. So my comment was with regard to SS1, can both the city and pandemic emergency police powers be included for oversight, transparency, and community accountability too? Considering what Chief Cook was saying, which was a very thoughtful, contribution by the chief that I'm commenting on. And then with regard to HS2, will Evanston rethink policing to increase protection, engagement, and investment in vulnerable residents yet to come forward? Because it's hard for them to come forward regarding larger issues of health and well-being. In terms of community leaders and agencies that are forward-thinking, grassroots efforts and grassroots community kinds of input are highly valued and difficult to get a hold of. And then I said, can shared safety at us get us there faster and more completely if we engage grassroots inputs directly now? And then the 5 blueprint, and then I give the references. So I just mentioned the 5 blueprint principles summarized and excerpted below. The public health early intervention framework. B is well-being, stability, and affordable housing. And I bring that up because affordable housing is one of the stabilizing factors, and yet one of the most stressful factors if it's a problem with regard to finding housing or keeping housing. Crime survivor insights and better outcomes. I think that's huge because if you've been a victim of a crime survivors are the people who are going to help you with regard to the insights that are needed for better decisions. Breaking the cycle of harm for critical needs. That is huge. And then the last one, continuous community building and transparency gets back to what Betty and the other speakers are talking to about the importance of transparency and citizen oversight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then Adam, what was the name of our last speaker?
Adam Marcourt, but he was here, but I don't see him now.
Okay.
Mr. Stowe, I'm actually texting him right now. He just told me he's not able to comment and that he yields his time. Oh, no.
That sounded like Mr. Davis. Thank you.
So, Alderman Revell, it sounds like Adam will not be joining or speaking.
Right, okay, well, maybe he can speak at our next meeting then. So let me just comment briefly about our order of business this evening on our agenda. We're changing the order of the items again. And so first we're going to hear about the shared safety framework, which can, I think, give us a good blueprint for reimagining policing and public safety for Evanston. Then we'll continue with our discussion of alternative emergency response system to determine whether we want to recommend that to be included in the 2021 budget. Then we're going to hear about from our legal staff about issues involved in reallocating positions away from the police department, and also an update from Chief Cook that's been in our packet. So Alderman Fleming, can I ask you to introduce our speakers about the shared safety framework?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for moving them earlier. We have 3 speakers tonight who are going to speak to us, give us a very brief presentation on the shared safety framework. This was brought to my attention by Evanston resident who also is going to speak, Evangeline Seamark. She can tell you her story, but when I learned about it, I thought it was very interesting and applicable to our group as we just think about how we might, reimagine policing, but also how we might respond to 911 calls, but then who we need to be listening to. So a lot of people has talked about, grassroots and such, but I think there's another population of people that I had not thought about that I want us to hear from. So Evangeline Seamark will be part of this presentation, as well as Marissa, I think it's Arona, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, and John Mackey, and they are with the Alliance for Safety and Justice. So they have a couple slides, and then we can have a discussion if you all would like.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the members of this committee, and good evening. My name is Evangeline Seamark. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman who has lived in Evanston's 8th Ward for 16 years. I'm a survivor of multiple forms of violence, many of which were never reported. My accountability is to survivors who bear the disproportionate burden of violence, including Black and Indigenous people, young people, immigrant communities, LGBTQ individuals, disabled people, poor people, and people living in homelessness. I appear before you tonight as the mother of Yaquez Seamark, who was killed by gun violence in Evanston in 2018, just 5 months before his 21st birthday. Yaquez is my only born child and was my absolute joy. I miss him every second of the day. Survivors are part of a community that we didn't choose. Our journeys are not the same, but we all know that profound grief and shock and trauma that comes in the wake of violent crime. We understand how the endless list of secondary losses can impact a survivor's quality of life for years and even decades after the violence occurs. Survivors know that our experiences and insights are rarely centered in discussions about criminal justice and violence prevention, but we should be, because we know firsthand what it's like to actually face and recover from violence. Since Yaquez was murdered, I've spent many of my sleepless nights wondering why someone would choose to take my son's life. Like many survivor parents, I may never find out why, but this is the fundamental question: why someone would end up hurting others, that safety solutions must examine in order to get to the root causes of violence and prevent future harm. The lack of safety in Evanston is a public health issue, not a policing issue. The system of policing could not have prevented my son's murder, and it could not have prevented the other unreported violence I have experienced. Survivors understand that in order to break the cycle of harm, we must re-envision and rethink our approaches to community safety. As a country, we are witnessing how responding to crime after the fact is just not enough to keep communities safe. And in some cases, and especially for Black people, it can do more harm than good. So overwhelmingly, survivors seek an approach to safety that invests in prevention, intervention, and healing. Our communities need to be well in order to be safe. Survivors want safety solutions that move us from security for some to safety for all. Tonight, you'll hear about shared safety, which is a survivor-centered framework that can help us move to a vision of safety for all. For the past year, I've had the honor and the privilege to learn from John and Marisa, who you will hear from next, as well as my fellow survivors who are members of Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. These conversations on shared safety are happening with survivor leaders across Illinois, and I am here to encourage Evanston to move boldly as a leader in this work. And now I'll pass it over to you, John.
Hi. Hear me? Oh, yep. Thanks, Evangeline.
Can everyone, I'm sorry to interrupt, John, this is Marisa. Can everyone see the share screen, the PowerPoint?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
As Evangeline said, my name is John Mackey. I'm the Local and State Government Best Practices Director, the Alliance for Safety and Justice. I want to thank all the members for letting us appear before you and all the residents who attended. You know, it's whenever I get to do this sort of thing, I'm always heartened and inspired by the hard work folks like you are doing, you know, which I think right now there's no question, you know, that we find ourselves in a moment of great peril, great pain, but I think at the same time, even greater promise. And really, you know, I have some notes here written down about what I want to say to you all, but really I just want to echo what Evangeline said far better than I ever could. You know, we have a system of justice that was built in the name of victims. But what our research shows, what crime survivors like Evangeline tell us, is that it does not always help victims heal. It does not always address the trauma of crime, particularly for folks who are most harmed and who are also least served. My organization, the Alliance for Safety and Justice, is dedicated to reforming the justice system by asking, what do victims want? What do victims need to be safe and also to heal? In 2017, actually this is the slide here is from this report. We did a survey, the first in Illinois, asking crime victims what they thought about their justice system. And you know what we found in Illinois is what we find over and over again in states across our country, is that most victims of crime, you know, want a very different kind of response than what our current system provides. They want a system that does not over-rely on punishment at the expense of prevention and services, but invests in those sorts of things. In this spirit, we recently created, when the pandemic began, the Illinois Coalition for Shared Safety. This is a coalition that's in many ways unprecedented. It has traditional leaders in victim services, like the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault, but also street violence prevention, reentry providers. It's unprecedented in the sense that even though these organizations and leaders have worked in the same space, it's not until recently that we've all begun talking to each other. And I think we're talking to each other for the very same sorts of reasons that you're all here today. We know that there's something not quite right about our current system. You know, there's many good parts about it. It does lots and lots of good work, but it needs a new vision. It needs a new framework. And that's what we're here to talk to you today about. You know, as Evangeline said, to help Illinois and cities throughout Illinois move from a system that prioritizes the security of some and moves towards a system that lifts up the safety of all. I believe Evanston can be a real leader here, both in Illinois and also nationally. You have a great history. You're known for your progressive politics. You know, I think this committee is a great example of this and the vigorous debate we had to start it. So I'm excited for this conversation, and let me turn it over to my colleague, Marisa, who's worked with local jurisdictions like cities like Evanston across the country, and she'll talk about her work. Marisa?
Thank you, John. I also just want to thank the committee members, Alderwoman Fleming, for this invitation, everyone who gave public comments at the beginning. It's such a important, critical conversation always, especially in these times. There's rich content here. Let me see if I can give you a very quick 2 or 3 minute overview of shared safety, acknowledging this will hopefully be a continuing conversation with all of you in smaller groups, one-on-ones, whatever the committee members think would be most impactful. At its core, shared safety is a framework. It's not a program. It's not an initiative. It's not something that outsiders bring into a community like Evanston and people say, oh no, another blueprint to fund, another program, another initiative, another pilot, right? You pilot something and it's never going to get scaled up. Shared safety is a framework that came out of all of the conversations we've had across the country with survivors, law enforcement, probation chiefs, elected officials, and everyone agreeing, and I've heard this from, I think, every law enforcement officer I've worked with across the country. Law enforcement has been forced to become the first responder to the failures of all the systems that came before us. The tough on crime era, the 80s and 90s, and there was, when prison and jail budgets got really bloated in government budgets, the over-reliance on one system, the overspending on one system really resulted in defunding critical prevention and intervention in health and well-being systems. And so violence and trauma and chronic violence and trauma are really now symptoms of decades of defunding education, safe parks, prenatal care for at-risk young women, helping our most vulnerable populations, really addressing protective factors instead of focusing solely on criminogenic factors, scaling up and looking at what makes people safe. How do we get more of that, right? Instead of the traditional system, we have to wait until crime and harm happens, and then we kind of figure out what punishment to dole out to the person who caused the harm, according to a penal code that is in a book somewhere developed by someone else that hasn't been impacted by that kind of harm. And what we've heard from survivors, you saw, we have links to the reports that we can share. The punishment-centric model, overspending on corrections at the exclusion of prevention and well-being, that rarely results in accountability to the person who caused the harm and healing or justice to the person who was harmed. And so we did this research for a couple of years. Some of our biggest allies, individuals who contributed to this body of work, include law enforcement, police chiefs, working with survivors, working with departments of public health, working with the heads of behavioral health, health and human services. And I think anyone who's worked in government, and I've certainly worked in a lot of government, I think everyone would agree there are some, if not many, silos. And there are many great people doing a lot of great work. And through the work of the way systems are set up, innovative work, it's really hard to scale up and make those connections. Shared safety doesn't come in and put the blame on anyone. It really is an overlay you can use to identify all of the great stuff that might already be happening in your community, really taking a crime survivor-centered approach to amplify those voices. And when you do that, you start having a different kind of conversation, and you have to shift to a public health frame. And then the definition of safety isn't the absence of crime, it's the presence of well-being. And traditional systems measure safety in terms of arrest rates and crime rates. But if much of crime is not reported, what does that really tell us about how safe we are? What does that tell us about who's most vulnerable? There are other things we need to measure. There's a lot to unpack there. We're just gonna, plant the seed here, continue the conversation. We do wanna make a note that the definition, the shared safety definition of survivors, this might be cut off on your screen with the video, but we'll send everyone the PowerPoint. Crime survivors are anyone who has been directly impacted by or experienced crime or violence or trauma. Sexual assault survivors, childhood sexual assault survivors, any survivor of assault. Crime survivors are also anyone who has witnessed crime and violence, family members, community members who might have seen something happen, people who might live in violent homes that are experiencing chronic violence. They've had their daily life impacted by crime and violence. One would say in this time of the pandemic, all of us are enduring chronic trauma on a daily basis from the news, right? We all need to sort of center survivor voices around what creates safety. So generally the most harmed and the least helped or most vulnerable communities are survivors who are not integrated at a decision-making table. And we're going to shift right now, if we can, to questions and answers. That was a very truncated version. If it felt disconnected with anyone, we want to continue the conversation. Here's one sort of side-by-side chart that sums up the differences between a traditional approach and a shared safety approach. And it might be a good site to rest on while we get some Q&A if the committee members would like to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for this presentation. Thank you, Alderman Fleming, for making the connection. And Evangeline, thank you for sharing your story. Very, very moving story. So committee members, questions and comments and thoughts about how we might make use of this framework going forward? Yep, Alderman Fleming.
Yeah, so just to elaborate, so I really found this interesting because obviously as you talk about defunding or imagining or whatever words people want to use, a lot of the, I think, concern opposed to that comes from what will happen if there's a violent crime, right? We have to have police because we have to have this response to violent crime. And I think in this committee, at least we've tried to be very clear that we are not at the point of talking about abolishing police. We're very much going to have police, but we also understand that police don't need to respond to every call that they get. There's another response we can look at. So this, doesn't really focus on that one piece that we've been talking about, but I thought for our bigger thought and conversation, this was really impactful to me, particularly when you have someone who has survived probably what I would think is the worst kind of crime, right? Like to lose a child, and to have someone experience that and say, I don't think that having more police on the street is what would have saved my child, right? So, I think we assume that is what people are going to ask for, and that's the fear factor. So this, even this screen that they have here, I mean, and Chief Cook has mentioned this, right? Like we need other things. And so the defunding movement is really talking about how to get that money back into other services that can keep any people out of the, from being an offender particularly, or even a survivor. But I would love for us to kind of figure out how we can use this in our next step. So when I had the opportunity to talk to these individuals, they talked about these, and Marissa, correct me, the name of it is kind of these conversations, what they do throughout communities. And I love that she was very clear to say this is not a program. We're not asking you to buy something or to adopt this, right? But the idea that we could, as we always do in Evanston, speak to our residents about what is safety, because everyone does not think that safety is more police officers, right? That's very clear from everything you see on the news nowadays. But everyone doesn't think that safety is also, just having a social worker or any other kind of community member respond to an issue. So I would really love for us to hear more about that maybe and think through if that is something that we think in our kind of next steps in our long-term planning would be worth us discussing in the community, because obviously we are voted in by the citizens, so we need to hear what they have to say. But I think we need to move a little bit past this, like getting rid of police, which makes a lot of people fearful, into what do we want in our community to be safe. And I think this, for me, made a lot of sense. And to understand that this has, been developed by survivors of crime, because I have not, survived such traumatic crime. So I would only assume what that person needs. And I think as government, we realize that is not really the best place to make decisions from. So we don't want to be assuming what people need. We want to be hearing from them and then incorporating their perspective as much as possible into these changes we're going to make. So if you could just, Marissa, talk a little bit about that visioning space, I think you called it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Alderwoman. So they're called Visioning Safety focus groups. We did them for about 2 years in person, pre-COVID times. We had a lot of lessons learned. We did groups with law enforcement peer groups, elected, survivors, business owners, a mix of individuals, youth in a high school leadership program, youth who had been in the foster system, homeless individuals, individuals in detention. A sheriff let us come into the jail for the female and male population with recording equipment and cameras to do these exercises. The way the visioning safety focus groups are set up and the way the questions are asked, they're asked so that when communities come together to discuss safety, safety discussions really often should always involve very hard conversations, right? Racial injustice, systemic racism, just all of the issues that are coming up nowadays. And shared safety does it in a way that we can reach a space of sort of shared values. And when we've done these groups, now we're going on year 3, now they're virtual, we record them all, we get common themes among all the groups. We've had a group of men in detention in a jail, and the same answers come up, the same themes come up as survivors, women survivors of assault. And that's because the question that shared safety poses starts with, and it's going to seem awkward, and if this feels awkward, then we're doing it right. It starts with, think of a time that you felt safe. Imagine your sensory, what did you have? And the job of shared safety is to hear from survivors, business owners, individuals, hear those personal reflections of what was present when they felt safe, and then work with electeds to translate that into advocacy recommendations based on survivor needs. Because the traditional method of asking community members, how did the system fail you? Tell us how to fix it. How should we do it? Not only re-traumatizes many people, but it presumes that individuals can articulate their feelings in a way that can be heard. And so when you ask someone, tell me about a time you felt safe versus what do we need for safety, or what makes you feel safe, you get different answers, and you start from a place of shared value. And you'll have to see it to experience it, but that gets us to conversations that touch on racial injustice, systemic racism, acknowledging a history of harm to Black bodies, Black and brown bodies, privileges. It gives space for people to really speak where they're coming from without having to feel defensive, and develop a way that's creating safety. So we start with peer groups. We start with people who might know each other in a small community. So we create a safe space. We do multiple groups. By the way, this is in-kind technical assistance. This is our job. So the cities do not pay us for it. We're helping you do this. We identify themes, and then we start merging groups together, and you'll get sort of a shared safety priority or guidelines for Evanston, or even by neighborhoods. And then you can leverage that work regionally with other focus groups that are going on in the area and across Illinois, and up to state advocacy efforts that we're working on that will in turn hopefully come back down and leverage to support Evanston and what you're thinking of. So this isn't a one-off or an end-all, right? It's this really way of thinking, how can we leverage all of these voices in a way that's different, and start connecting a lot of dots. Does that make sense? And the visioning safety focus groups. That resonate with people? Make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Alderman Fisk, do you have no? Or Alderman Braithwaite?
Just a quick comment. Thank you very much, Alderman Fleming, for introducing us to this group. Evangeline, always good to see you. Thank you so much for your continued advocacy for our families in town. Yesterday, Chief Cook, just as I'm listening to this in the last presentation, mentioned that we don't do enough for our mothers who are survivors after these tragic killings. And I want to take some time just to digest this, because it's a lot that you've thrown together in a short period of time. So I hope that we'll have an opportunity to revisit this. I don't think you're going to get a quick answer in this meeting, but I do find the services needed, and I just want to thank you, and again, for the presentation, and thank you very much, Alderman Fleming, to to bringing this to the table.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it would be my guess that as we move further along in this conversation, we'll maybe have you all back and revisit this.
Yeah.
I know that I told you already that I'm interested in, having a visioning state or session, in my ward, as we've already kind of been talking about safety and police and all that. So I'm happy to be the model and see how, and invite others to participate. I do want to remind folks who are listening, because we're getting to the budget session, as Marissa said, this is an in-kind technical support. So as people are, concerned about money and consultants and all those things that we should pay for, this is something that we have, if we choose the opportunity to at least have some conversations in our community with some trained professionals who are not looking to, sell us anything and be paid for their service. So I think that's important to remind folks who are listening of. So thank you all. I'll let the chair wrap up.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll be continuing this conversation at our future meetings.
Thank you. We're happy in any format that you would like to start the groups, one-on-one, small groups, peer groups. Alderwoman Fleming, we'll wait to hear from you. And again, all of us are just so impressed with the leadership shown here and public comment, and would be really excited to help you all work on this. There are no easy answers. There never have been. There certainly aren't now. So thank you all for your leadership.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, then let's turn to the next item on our agenda, which is continuing our conversation about an alternative emergency response system. So Mayor Haggerty's policing Q&A of a week ago featured speakers from Denver and Olympia, Washington, talking about their versions of the CAHOOTS program. And certainly what they're doing in their communities is not exactly what we want to do here in Evanston, but I think provides some very helpful examples for us as we want to think about what might work for us here. So this morning I took the initiative to have a nice phone conversation with Ann Larson. She was one of the speakers from Olympia, Washington on the mayor's program a week ago, and she's a good, really eloquent spokesperson for their program. Our two communities are quite different. The main group that their program works with and for their emergency responses is a very large homeless population, and the business community is a major stakeholder in this whole program because they experience a lot of homeless individuals sleeping on the doorsteps of their businesses, et cetera. So what was interesting in talking with Ann is the very lengthy process of discussions that it took to actually to develop the details for their program. They had stakeholder meetings. I should back up and say the Olympia, Washington citizens passed a referendum to accept a property tax levy specifically to fund a public safety fund. And so the fund was used initially to hire Ann Larson to then go ahead and create their response system. So what she started out with some stakeholder meetings, one with the social service agencies in the community to get a better sense of what they saw as the problem. Then there were stakeholder meetings with the business community to see how they saw the problem. And then they did an in-depth survey with the police to find out what their thoughts were. And then all that then turned into an RFP. And then the proposals that came into the RFP, she had reviewed by a group of the social service agencies rather than the city or the police department. Then ultimately they hired an agency, not actually based in Olympia, it's from a nearby community. The agency was hired in January 2019, and they spent then about 3 months of training the team members, the crews, the community crisis response unit, the crew team spent about 3 months getting with a lot of on-the-ground training, learning the ins and outs of the community and the resources, et cetera. And then they began service in April. So they've had over a year now of operating the program. In the first 2 months, they went on nearly 700 calls. A lot of them are self-initiated. Sometimes a police officer will say, gosh, I don't really need to be involved in this call, and they'll call the crew team. Obviously, some come from 911. Some maybe come from the business community that they're familiar with the crew team. And the really big benefit of the program is the outcome for the people that are in the crisis situation. The crew team can spend a lot more time with each of the individuals that they're responding to help, much more time than just a police responder can spend. Not only do they spend more time at the crisis situation in the moment, but then they follow up the following day, the following week. It's more of a sort of a full round of support and assistance. So it really is a social service response rather than a police response to the calls. In Olympia, they have the program 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. and it's 7 days a week. One of the main jobs of the crew team is waking people up at 7 in the morning, because a lot of them have been spending the night sleeping in the downtown. So it's a different situation than I think we would be looking at here in Evanston. I'm envisioning that we would initially aim for something with not covering as many hours in the day, maybe only Monday to Friday and not the weekends initially, so that we'd have a smaller scale program with a smaller budget. The budget in Olympia, Washington is $550,000, which I think is more than we're going to be able to find in our 2021 budget. And I guess my other thought was, rather than our Human Services Committee trying to come up with all the details of what the program would look like and how to implement it, that maybe we could create a subcommittee to work on that would involve some social service providers, some various stakeholders, and so it wouldn't become part of our ongoing Human Services Committee agenda. So I throw that out to my committee members for their thoughts and comments. Don't all speak at once. Yeah, Alderman Fleming.
Yeah, so I did look at, I'm looking at another computer, so I'm not ignoring you all. I did look at the Olympia program as well as the Denver program. I agree with you in that, it was definitely an interesting model, but definitely fell more on that, homeless services model. And I think that when I think about the calls, when we looked at that 911 data and calls that our police got that I would think, aren't necessarily policing matters, they, encompass a wide variety of things, right? So definitely some of the things that they have here in the Olympia model, I think would be needed here and probably very much helpful. But as you said, like the waking people up and all that, Connection does have two outreach staff that, I don't know if they're going to wake people up, but they do handle some more of those things. And so, this would be something that definitely they could work with the Connection staff and refer people to, but don't need to replicate their work. And then when I looked at the Denver plan, it seemed, and I'm trying to get my notes together, but I did like that they had a social worker, I think, and a paramedic, or at least someone with some medical training, because I think, I would imagine, particularly with people who have some really severe mental health issues, the medical training might be necessary. Not that they're, giving medical care on the side of the road, but they might, have a skill set there that is necessary. I don't know if we need an EMT or some other type of CNA or something another. So I did like that piece of their motto. I agree when we get started, maybe those hours aren't the hours. We could look at the police call data and see if, some weekends, evenings are necessary or daytime. But also thinking through past the response to 911, which I think one of them mentioned, which was making these connections with some of the familiar faces in the community. And so even if they're not out on a 911 call, kind of doing some community engagement work, because again, my thought is trying to not only overtax 911 with calls that they don't really, need a 911 or need a police response to, but also doing a little bit more with reaching out to folks before they even are making that call. So I guess that might fall a little bit to homeless, but also other people I think of, I see who are just frequent in our city. They have homes, but they have some other difficulties. And I did like that. I believe the Olympia team worked with some housing crisis. So I was interested in that piece, as we unfortunately are probably going to see some more foreclosures whenever those open back up in the state. And so thinking about that as, I don't know exactly what they do, but thinking about that as something that these folks might be able to also just at least be in touch with people on. I would agree with the subcommittee. I think my only concern with that is making sure that we stay on task if we're trying to get something in the budget. That we have, I guess, another month. I think the budget's coming the beginning of October, so that we go to subcommittee, do that, the month of September with a very aggressive goal. Obviously, everything's not going to be solved, and we might find that it's just too big, but I don't know in terms of pulling a subcommittee together, if that's something we have to bring, to council and then get approval with the mayor and have people apply and all those things. So I would be just a little bit concerned with the timeline if we're going to subcommittee, of how quickly we can pull those folks together. And then again, making sure the subcommittee covers a variety of experiences and not just our social service committee, our social service community.
Right, yeah. Just to respond, and then I'll go to Alderman Fisk. I don't envision it being the kind of committee that needs a mayoral appointment. I mean, the alternatives to arrest committee, for example, or didn't come to council, let's say. But I guess I'm envisioning that we put a placeholder in the budget, and so the subcommittee wouldn't have to be, have the program all figured out by October 15th. They'd have till the end of the year when the funding actually became available. I see that Director Ogbo is maybe going to chime in on the funding question.
Yeah, absolutely. Good day, everyone. This is Ike Ogbo, Director, Health and Human Services Department. Before this meeting, I received a phone call from the interim assistant city manager, who stated that Erica, our city manager, will be able to see some money carved out in the tune of about $200,000 to focus on a pilot but limited program before 2021 budget. So I just wanted to make that announcement as we continue this conversation.
Great. Okay, that's helpful information, because that's a reasonable amount of money, I think, for a pilot program. And when we say pilot, it's not something that we are going to discontinue. That's more learning how it works and then expanding it as we go forward. But Alderman Fisk, did you have some comments?
Yeah, I was going to mention the concept of a placeholder in the budget. I mentioned at the last meeting that I felt that this is really complicated. It's very positive in my view. But it is complicated. And one of the things that I think I'm missing are getting all of our social service providers, our partners, everyone represented, everybody at the table, so that we can have a consolidated response so that we know exactly what we need, what others can provide. We touched on that a little bit at our last meeting, and that was really useful. But I think there are other organizations too that we probably need to hear from. I'm a little confused about connections, because at some time I know they're really busy, and today was the deadline for them to have everyone out of the Orrington. And I know Betty Bogg has been working tirelessly to do that. And, you know, I'm just so respectful of her and her efforts and what a difference that has made in the lives of folks. But I do think if we're going to get this right, we need to get everybody at the table. And it doesn't, I think we're the least important people at the table. I think getting these folks there and understanding how we can put together this program. And I do like the Olympia model. On the West Coast, of course, they, as you said, Alderman Fleming, I mean, the focus very much is more on homelessness because it's just a more temperate climate. And so they have a year-round problem. But we're working very, very hard on addressing that issue, at least in my ward. And I appreciate the efforts of the people who are doing that. But I want them at the table along with everybody else. So that's to say that I do think that this is a good thing to go ahead. I'm happy to hear that Erica is at least willing to put that placeholder there. That gives us a little bit more time. I agree with this subcommittee. I don't know who you, I guess Alderman Fleming, you're coming in as new chair, and but maybe you and Alderman Revvy can work this out between the two of you. But I think it's a good idea. I think it's a really positive step forward, and I don't think everyone necessarily understands how interconnected this all is. And I think it's not a failure of our wards, but our wards are really different. We represent different groups of people. And I sort of look at the fourth ward as sort of the epicenter of a lot of stuff. I'd like to hear what Alderman Wilson says. I think in the information that we got, his ward had the highest reports of crime, highest reports of calls to 911. I've not had a conversation with him about that, but I would like to hear from him. So I think having the broader conversation at council and then setting the subcommittee, I think is probably necessary at this point. So I would encourage that.
Thank you. Alderman Braithwaite, do you want to? No, okay. Right, so I guess the question is the next step to make a recommendation to City Council and get the feedback and the buy-in from all of our colleagues. So then we go ahead, assuming we have the buy-in, with creating the subcommittee to develop the details of this program. Yeah, Alderman Fisk.
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to mention is that the Olympic program, the police were at the table. I mean, the police were an important part of this, and the police were, working with, as you mentioned, Alderman Revvy, working with the, folks would often call the business owners or whoever would often call, and the police would make a determination who needed to go out, or they would call the providers, and then that could be determined. That's I think something I want to hear more from Kelly about our contract and how that works, and whether we need to address any of those cooperative details. I don't know the answer to that, but I think if we look at this without the cooperation and participation of the police, it doesn't work well.
Right.
And I've been kind of struggling with the well-being checks, thinking that, well, maybe we could, use an EMT and a social worker, and they could respond. But I've heard recently, and again, I don't know whether this is true, Kelly, maybe you can tell us this, but that for some well-being checks or death notifications, we need to have the police accompany in case there is a situation that calls for a criminal investigation, for example. So those are the parts that I don't understand well, but they would inform us in terms of how this all comes together.
Right. Yeah. Just real quickly, in terms of the well-being checks, I asked Anne in Olympia whether their crew team responded to those, and she said no, they don't. Just because So for those, she recommended a police officer with maybe a social worker, that there be this kind of hybrid model. And I have seen that being used in other communities.
Yeah, I think Illinois law may require it at least on death notifications or well-being checks. So
obviously one of the things we need more information about.
Right.
Does anybody want to make a motion? Do we need a motion?
I think,
yeah, Alderman Fleming.
yeah, I just need a little more clarity, I think, still, just in terms of, so you are suggesting that we send, propose a subcommittee, so we would send that to full council. We're not meeting for a full council until September 14th.
Right. I guess what I'm suggesting we send to council is our recommendation that the 2021 budget include funding for an alternative emergency response system, and with the details to be developed by the subcommittee, I guess, the details of the actual program. But the thing that we want the council's buy-in is the idea that we would devote funding towards this kind of alternative response program.
And so are we right now going forward? I mean, I understand that Erica's placeholding $200,000, but I think part of this conversation, at least for me, was from the folks in the community who were looking at our police budget in comparison to our human services and other kind of more citizen support programs, and looking at how to reallocate. Now, we don't need to reallocate just for the purpose of reallocating, but I think, I still think we, in my opinion, should have the conversation, about a piece of that. And so if there are, as we mentioned yesterday, if we get this thing set up and it's working, then there are going to be some calls, or hopefully quite a few calls, that we're able to defer from the police response to whatever this community crisis, whatever response is, right? So I think you mentioned last week that, so that we need, I don't know if you said we need less police, but police will not need to be out doing these things that they maybe don't need to do. And so then do we need all the police that we have if they're not responding to all the calls that we have? So I think that I'm fine going to subcommittee. I think that's the right way to go. I'm fine that we have the $200,000 as a placeholder. I don't know if that's, when we have the subcommittee, that's all that we think we're going to need. There's lots of, we're having full-time staff, they have benefits and so on and so forth. So 200,000 is a great start, but I don't want to go forward saying that's our end all be all. I think there's still time to review other budgets.
Alderman Fisk.
And I think one of the main points about the model is that there's a lot to be developed going forward. There's a lot to be learned going forward, and we can't obviously make the assumption at the beginning of where we're going to end up. The process provides us with the details that we need in order to take next steps forward. So if we save a lot of money, for example, then things can be reallocated, and but we don't know that yet, and we need to work through this, and that would be the subcommittee's charge, I think, is to work through this and then see how it's going, because we won't know until we put it in place, and that's a good reason to put it in place, is to find out.
I do agree. I want to just remind that regardless of what this new model is, that could be, totally amazing. Again, the call came about defunding was the response to people in our community who do not feel safe with the police. And I think even having this model that engages takes the police engagement away from some folks, but it doesn't really address, and I don't know that we're not going to address, but it does not address the call for people who feel unsafe with our police. So this is one piece of that, and that is definitely a longer process. I don't think that we're going to get and answer that question, but just as our presenters talked about, shared safety, calling the police or having the police respond to you is not what everybody in our community says brings them safety. And so I think that that's still something that we need to keep in the forefront of our conversation. And again, we're not going to solve that in one conversation, because we need to hear from people who are having that experience, as Alderman Revvy talked about today from the mayor's call. But everyone receives our police differently. So we should not I think move forward without keeping that in the forefront of our conversation.
Yeah. Now, this is obviously just one small program in the bigger picture, and one small step forward, I think. Alderman Fisk. Yeah.
And Alderman Fleming, I agree with you entirely on that. I think that's really important, but I think that it's also part of what we're moving toward. And as the pilot program starts and then expands, and then I think we will achieve that goal. I think that all the reading that I did today, having people out in the community responding, so the social service workers, just the fact that they were responding, whether it was with police or not with police, that was, it certainly gave the signal that we hear the people who are well, we hear everyone, but who are asking us to do more, who want us to do more, and maybe even those who are affected who aren't asking us to do more but are affected. And once we start the program and it is successful, that hopefully they will see that as a positive result. So my glass is half full here. I think we can really make some real strides toward creating the kind of community that we want, and that our most vulnerable and most affected people deserve and are asking for. So I think we will get there. We have to start though, and I want to say, especially to the person who was speaking at citizen comment, my struggle with this has always been that this is something that we can only solve as a community conversation with everybody out there participating in it and recognizing that folks are coming from different points of view, but we can make things better. And I think the chief has been really helpful in that. And I want to thank him for his comments. But you may disagree with someone or agree with them on how they're approaching it or their point of view, but the fact is that we have to encourage everybody's points of view here, and we have to work through some hard stuff in order to get to hopefully the more positive place that we're all headed for. So I'm very thankful to you guys for for having this conversation, and to you, Alderman Revvy, for your leadership on this, because I think it's been a really good conversation. I read absolutely everything, and I'm just extremely impressed with what's going on in other communities. And I want to, I'm just amazed that, that we have the opportunity now to really get this started. But we can't be calling each other names anymore. You can't call the police names. You can't call anybody names. You've got to, it just doesn't help. It doesn't help the conversation. So please, folks, I mean, your comments, everyone's comments are welcome, but we got to work together on this.
So what is your pleasure, committee, in terms of a next step here?
I'm happy to lead the subcommittee. I don't know if you can nominate yourself or whatever, but I'm trying to be proactive here. And so if we're going to council on the 14th, I don't know the rules well enough to know how we have to do this. Alderman Braithwaite, you can maybe help me refresh when you started alternatives to arrest. But again, I think the 14th, we have a very large agenda already. And so whatever we can do to get the committee formed and meeting quickly, because then once you even get the committee formed, you have to get people invited and then get their calendars clear and all that stuff. So we all know that can take some time. And I want people to be available to participate, but also people to participate in the budget process. So I'm happy to lead the committee. I just would like us to do whatever we can to get it formed and meeting quickly, because we know that could easily take a month.
Right. I think the first thing is for all of us to pool our suggestions of which, who are the stakeholders who should be, would be really important to have on the subcommittee, and come up with that list first and get that I appreciate your willingness to chair that committee. That would be great.
I think we also have to get the committee approved, right? And there must be some kind of legal. Kelly, can you help?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, right. So we can get the shape of the committee ready to also take to the council at the meeting on the 14th, and the suggested. Maybe we have to talk to the mayor about how this part works. I don't
Alderman
know.
Braithwaite, can you remind us
But do you
your alternative to arrest?
I think.
Yeah, so, I mean, we definitely have the cause and the mission and what we want to achieve, and then whether we come up with the composition of the committee or Alderman Fleming, since you're willing to chair, you would then help to shape the composition of the committee, make the recommendations to the mayor, and then the mayor would make the proper appointments and assign staff to provide support.
Because
That's how at least that was it with alternatives to rest.
Yeah, Mayor Tisdall, I think, appointed the committee. I think it was back under her mayorship, I think.
It was after the mayoral race, so I'm
okay.
pretty sure it was Mayor Haggerty.
Okay, yeah. But it didn't have to go to council. It was just
Correct, because it isn't a standing committee. I think we treated it more like a task force.
right, exactly. Yeah, so that's the model then. Okay, so we're going to send our ideas of committee members' perspectives, stakeholder views that should be represented on this subcommittee. We'll send all that to Alderman Fleming. And at the council meeting on the 14th, we will be proposing allocating money in the 2021 budget for this alternative response system, and this with the details to be developed for council approval in the fall months, with ready to go once the budget is approved. Does that sound roughly okay? Alderman?
I think by December 31st, or what date was it that Ike, did you say that Erica had a date? Did I hear the date of December?
No, there's no particular date. All she said was that we have some money carved out for this purpose, $200,000, so that we can develop a pilot program.
Okay, all right, okay.
All right. So and we can have an update at our next Human Services Committee meeting then on where we are in terms of identifying people for the subcommittee. Does that sound okay for Alderman Fleming?
Yeah, and I think I would maybe I'll check in with the mayor or with legal.
Sure.
I have a heart. I don't want us to have a subcommittee of 50 people. Sure. Like, it needs to be workable and
right.
It needs to, for me, to be community voice as well as our, some nonprofit folks and all that stuff. So,
right.
And then I guess we need to get something to the full council as well, who will have an opinion on. I'm sure they have suggestions on who,
right,
or what area they want people to come from. So I'll get some clarity from that, from legal and from the mayor in terms of a timeline. And if we can get them appointed later, that would be great. I don't know if we have to go out to the community to let them know this is something we're doing, so people can, send in their names or what. I want to make sure we have as much voice as possible as Alderman Fisk. And even just with the 9 of us, there's someone or some perspective we're going to miss. So that's fine. The next Human Services meeting is on the 8th. Is that right?
I think so. Yeah, Tuesday the 8th.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's the 9th. It's Wednesday. It's Wednesday the 9th.
Well, except I've been seeing Tuesday the 8th.
No?
After we have executive session. We have something 4:30 and then 5 o'clock is human services.
Yeah, I think it's on Tuesday because we're not having city council that week.
Right.
But we can.
I will check on that.
Yeah,
okay.
That's a small detail, right?
I will check on that. Okay.
Great, thanks. Well, speaking of legal, we did want to hear from Kelly about any issues we need to be thinking about in terms of police department personnel and changes we might have in mind and those kind of things. So.
Good evening, members of City Council. Kelly Ganders, P Corporation Counsel for the City of Evanston. I'm happy to take direct questions as well. I've reviewed the collective bargaining agreement between the Order of Police and the City of Evanston, and I can just highlight some of the key points that Council needs to consider in reallocating resources. The first important thing to note is that the City of Evanston retains management rights under the collective bargaining agreement. So what that means is that if the city envisions its mission or objectives in a certain way, the leadership of the city has the right to implement those objectives. So for instance, if there was an old model of policing that the council at one point, and I'll just make up an example, 10, 15 years ago, saw the mission for the police department to be in one particular direction, but now has viewed what Evanston Police Department's mission should be in a different direction. We, the City of Evanston, have the right to, by our management and authority, direct the police department as to where we see those resources being allocated most. That doesn't necessarily mean that anyone on council has the authority to direct the chief of police in allocating his particular resources for emergencies, or the city manager in that regard, but the city can prioritize where it envisions the police department's mission, what it envisions it to be. So if it's more of and again, I'll create another example, if the mission seems to be more in community involvement, community development, then perhaps council may want to see the police department engage in activities that are more community development, community relations activities, as opposed to enforcement or punitive. Another important thing to note, the collective bargaining agreement expires on December 31st, 2022. So the city is under obligation to continue under the agreement that we are in now. There are certain immovables in the agreement. For instance, members of the FOP and members of the police department are entitled to certain pay scales with certain pay increases that go into effect periodically year to year. The most recent pay increase will be January 1st, 2021, which would give members a 2.25% increase on their pay. And there are steps for longevity pay increases along the way. If there are discussions that need to be had between the city management and union members in terms of where they see, again, these resources being allocated or where they see the vision of the police department to be going, there are provisions in the collective bargaining agreement for the city and the union to meet and confer. And those are called labor management meetings. And that's provided for in the collective bargaining agreement. So there's a way for the city and members to sit down and collaborate and discuss new developments in the city of Evanston. If we were looking at reallocating resources in such a way that would decrease the budget of the police department, for instance, which would require, and again, I'm not saying it will, I want to be very clear about that, but for instance, let's say council decided to decrease employees in the Evanston Police Department, they cut the budget. How that would work under the collective bargaining agreement is that layoffs go by seniority first. So it wouldn't necessarily mean that certain members of the police department that perform certain functions would be laid off first. It would go by seniority. Those with the least seniority would be laid off, and the reason would be either due to lack of resources or other legitimate reasons, which are not really defined under the collective bargaining agreement. And any returns to work are obviously by seniority as well. So those with the most seniority get returned to work first. If, let's say, those members of the police department that fall under the union contract were to be reallocated to another department, let's say, it's important to note that they are still entitled per the collective bargaining agreement to their same pay scale. So I just want to point that out for the council to note that if you're looking at a dollars and cents resources allocation, it's important to understand that the members are still entitled to their same pay per the collective bargaining agreement. So I hope at a high level that kind of highlights the agreement. For any grievances, obviously, the union, there's a process for the union and the city to come to terms on any grievances. But at a high level, that's kind of how the collective bargaining were to work. So I'm happy to take any specific questions to the best of my ability.
Great, thank you. Committee, any questions for Kelly? Yeah, Alderman Fleming.
Hey, Kelly, so that last piece you mentioned in terms of if you were to, get rid of any officers and still being, I think you said still being under our unit, our collective bargaining, still having to pay the officers. Is that what you were saying?
Well, if we were to reallocate officers, let's say we took 5 members and said, instead of performing tasks for the police department, we're going to have you perform tasks for a newly created department called public safety. Those officers are still under the collective bargaining agreement and they're still entitled to their same pay scale.
Okay, but if we said, for instance, and I'm looking at the job chart here, if we said, well, we don't need animal control anymore and we don't need, whatever this is, we don't need the TAC department. We're not making a new animal control person or, anything similar at the health department, and we're not out getting rid of those people just to make something similar. How does that compare with the union?
So the way that
can we be clear just before you respond that you're giving those as examples? I know
I'm giving
you are.
Hypotheticals, yes.
Yes, but just for everyone listening, so when it's reported to, thank you very much.
So I'm making a
My
hypothetical
apologies.
because I want to make the point that I understand what you're saying. We would not say, let's get rid of the animal warden, yet and still we're going to make an animal supervisor, right? I mean, I understand what you're saying, but if we just said, you know what, hey, we don't have as many stray animals, we don't need that position anymore, would that still leave us? And I understand anyone can make a grievance under the union, but with that type of termination, not be the same, I guess, grievance.
So and to Alderman Braithwaite's point, I'm not in any way giving advice on this topic. I'm just
I'm just trying to make it clear.
Hypotheticals.
Right.
So how it would work is, and I'm not sure who the tactical team or the animal warden, there's authority levels at this point. They could be very young members of the union. They could be very more experienced members of the union. Let's say they were the most experienced members with the most years in service. Those members of those teams would so the city would be saying, in essence, the police department is shrinking its number of employees to reallocate resources. So those individuals would not necessarily be laid off. They would be reallocated somewhere else, and there would be other individuals based on their seniority that would be laid off.
But if we didn't, okay, and I get that. So you're saying, again, and I don't even know who our new animal warden is, but if we say, hey, we don't have any more stray animals, whatever, we've solved our animal problem in Evanston. That particular person might not be laid off because they might have seniority. But if we decided, hey, we just don't need this function anymore, we could still get rid of the function. Now, the police, based on the union, would have to decide which person they're terminating, but we have the right to get rid of a function.
And well, I would say theoretically the answer to your question is yes, in part. I say that because if the chief of police were to determine, based upon what he understands in the community for his allocation of resources, if he needs to reallocate officers to perform a function that city council is seeking to eliminate due to public health or safety reasons, I think that's a separate conversation that we would all have to have, because again, it gets a little tricky when you're talking about instructing the chief of police on how to allocate his resources, or the city manager in that regard. But if as a council you were to say, we don't think we need those functions, we are eliminating those positions, then I think theoretically, yes, you can do that. Can the chief then say, well, fine, we don't have those teams anymore, or we don't have funding for those particular positions, but I'm using resources and from what I still have left to perform some of those other functions, I think he could probably do that as well.
Right, because he could do that as the chief in terms of some kind of internal reorganization.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, but that reorganization, is going to be a drastic reduction in service delivery that this town has become accustomed to doing. And when you start looking at reallocating people and changing their working conditions, you could have a grievance from the union on that could take months to resolve in through an arbitrator. So it's a process that you got to really be careful with.
And to Chief's point,
Sorry to interrupt.
to Chief's point, we'd have to be careful about creating redundancies. So if there were positions eliminated because the city deems the function unnecessary anymore, and you're asking other offices to perform a like function, then that's also a potential for a grievance. And then again, this goes before, assuming there's no compromise between the city and the union, this goes to an arbitrator who can decide whatever he or she wants to decide. And the city would be held to those rulings. So there's a lot, and again, this is just a very short leveled conversation, but there's a lot to consider going into those decisions. As you know, as Chief said, it's not as simple as just saying we're going to cut this or we're going to cut that, because there are layers here on how this works, and there's different directions the results can take. But I think you're all aware of that. But I'm just, again, I want to make sure you understand. I'm just answering on a very high level here, bullet points.
And these are similar to protections that our other unionized workers also have, correct? Yeah. So they're not.
Yeah, collective bargaining agreements across the board are generally similar in these types of terms.
Right. And we do lay off other unionized workers. All right, thank you.
Other questions from committee members? Okay, well, thank you, Kelly. Then our next item is the update we have from you, Chief Cook, about in your police department update memo. Do you want to say anything in particular about your memo, or should we just open it up to questions from the committee members?
No, I'll briefly go through the ones that are on here.
Okay.
Number one, department should assign final disciplinary authority to the chief of police. We have that in place. That is a recommendation, a best practice that we do currently have. Number two, the department should have public complaint process to make filing a complaint open to all. I thoroughly agree with that. That was one of the recommendations when the mayor formulated the citizen review complaint committee. So what we did was we decentralized the complaint process, where you don't have to come in a police station to file a complaint. You can file it online. You can go to the administrative adjudication department. And when 311 when they get back in the building, we're going to look at a process where maybe you can file it through 311. So we have decentralized the complaint process. Department should have policies on officer investigation that clearly define procedures for carrying out the investigations and seeing them through to completion, even if an officer separates from the department. We will carry out a complaint process through to completion. We always have. That is spelled out in our general orders and in our SOPs for the Office of Professional Standards. The department should regularly release to the public, in accordance with relevant state laws, data on disciplinary action and decisions, including those made by arbitrators. We have been doing that. I don't like to put people through a lot of process in order to get those, but I have to be careful in what I release on that due to possible litigation, unforeseen, and things of that nature. So, but we do in our annual report, we put that information in there, and we do fill the FOIAs as much as possible with the proper redactions that may be necessary. Number 5, the department should have policies that require supervisors to conduct ongoing reviews of stops, searches, arrests, and use of force. We do that. Officers know that it is punitive against them if they get into a use of force situation and they have not filed a use of force report. We don't tolerate that. We do audits of video of our, not only our in-car camera video, but also of our body camera video. Each supervisor is assigned to a number of officers under his span of control, and he is required to do audits on their video. And if he sees something that's inappropriate, then it gets pushed up to the Office of Professional Standards for investigation. Or if he sees something that was exceptionally done well, we'll utilize that video in a training scenario to show people how we would really like for it to be done. The department should require body cameras and develop policies for review and release and preservation of footage. All of that is mandated in state law. Every Evanston police officer, including myself, we are assigned body cameras, individual body cameras. We don't use body cameras from one shift to the next. Every officer has their own body camera, and our policies are appropriate in accordance with state law in our Lexipol general orders. And number 7, departments should implement an early intervention system to identify at-risk officers to help support their well-being. In 2018, the Evanston Police Department, under the leadership of Chief Addington, they embarked upon an early warning system benchmark, which is really the state of the art in tracking and review. It has a lot of modules in that program, not only use of force in those type of violations, but attendance violations, missing court, things of that nature, vehicle accidents. It tracks all of those, and when it gets to the benchmark as defined in that program, the officer, it will trigger a response from OPS to take the appropriate action, whether it's discipline or additional training. And that's pretty much it. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Any questions from the committee? Yeah, Alderman.
I have a question about, not that, but about something else in the Hilliard-Hines study. Can you take that question?
Sure.
Okay. So I was looking at that yesterday, and a couple of things. I know last week, Alderman Fisk talked about the staffing study that was recommended in there that we did not do. So I am interested in that after I looked at it and had a better understanding of what they were suggesting, because they had some suggestions on there that some of the staffing models that we use had been based on past practices and not really analyzed for, I guess, efficiencies. But I know that's a budget item, so we would need to discuss if that's something we have the money to outsource now. But it seems like that's one piece that we did not do with the Hilliard-Hines study at the time. But one other question I had on here was about, in this section that was key findings for the organizational structure of EPD. I think some of these things we did do, if I'm correct, but one of them was combining the net and TAC unit into one unit. If I'm looking at the org chart, it doesn't look like that had been done, but I want to just make sure I'm clear on that. Were they in two separate areas and now they kind of sit parallel in the org chart? Or was the suggestion to combine them as one total unit, so it be net and TAC together in one unit versus two different units?
The organizational structure situation, as outlined in the Hilliard-Hines report, centered upon span of control. And that's basically how efficient can one supervisor manage a number of people. Basically, what is the number of people that's appropriate for a supervisor to be responsible for? And we had some deficiencies in that, according to the Hilliard Heights report. And when I got here and reviewed it, I agreed with it. So we did make the appropriate changes with respect to having supervisors have the appropriate span of control. For instance, we had the executive officer position, which was filled by our police commander, making $150-some thousand a year, and nobody reported to him. That's an inefficient span of control. So I got rid of that position and I pushed it down to patrol, where that person has a greater span of control and is in more in line with operational efficiencies.
Okay, so did you combine the net and TAC?
Net and TAC was always under the control of one police commander. But when you look down on the sergeant level, the span of control for the sergeant to the officers, it was 3 officers and a sergeant. That's an inefficient span of control. The supervisor is capable of managing more people than that. And the other aspect, when you look at the allocation and span of control for people, the other aspect is span of knowledge. Is a more educated police officer or supervisor capable of managing more people? And the answer to that question is yes. If I'm highly educated, I'm confident in my job performance, and I've done it for a number of years, you can assume that that person has the expertise, knowledge, and skills to manage more people than what would be put out in a normal span of control. So I tend to teeter between span of control and span of knowledge. So I look at that together and I try to do what's appropriate in managing the officers that are on the street.
So for the TAC department, they have 1 sergeant and 4 detectives. For net, they have 1 sergeant and 9 detectives, an intelligent officer, and a crime analyst. So,
right. So now we got rid of the commander position so far because we can't fill it. That's a vacancy that we have in our organizational chart. And the reason it's like that is because we're in a temporary 12-hour shift, which has 4 aspects to it. You got the A day shift, A night shift, you got B day shift, and B night shift. So you require 4 commanders. I move one of those commanders that would normally have managed the Office of Professional Standards and the one that managed the net unit. I moved them down to patrol, and the other one was put on freeze when Dennis Leaks left. So if we stay on a 12-hour shift, we're going to need to fix those 2 positions or live with what we have now. For efficiency, I like to have a police commander in OPS, even though that span of control is limited to 2 sergeants and a commander. But it's about being able to order people of lesser rank to be able to fulfill a mission of discipline. Now, if a deputy chief needs discipline, I'm going to deal directly with that myself.
Okay.
Okay.
Any further questions?
Yeah. Yeah, so, right, Chief, did you need to talk to us about the other parts of your report, or is that?
No, Deputy Chief Wright is going to pick up from here.
Okay.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Just want to direct your attention to the mayor's 90-day pledge on use of force. If you look at that last paragraph, there's 2 bullets in that paragraph. Just wanted to highlight that the police department, we completed an internal review of our policy with our use of experts within the department. And based on that internal review, we did come up with some recommendations those recommendations will be some key additions to the policy that will minimize or seek to minimize use of force incidents, enhance some decision makers capabilities for the officers, and then provide more continuous training throughout the year on use of force. So in addition to that, the police department partnered with the Northwestern Neighborhood Network Initiative. They're known as N3, and they're currently conducting an internal review of our
policies. And that's with Soledad McGrath. She's a lawyer over at the N3, and also with Andrew Papachristos, who is the chair of the sociology department there.
Okay, and so that's a 90-day pledge or something. So when is our 90 days going to be finished?
So I believe for the completion of those steps, I believe the 90 days is September, I want to say 6 or 7. We plan to have a report back based on our conversations with Dr. Papachristos and his staff. We plan to have a report back by the end of this week. And we plan to have this item up for discussion for the entire council on the September 14th council meeting.
And they're going to look at our general orders in a post-George Floyd perspective. Are we being progressive enough in mitigation of situations with best practice in use of force?
Okay, thank you. All right, committee, anything else? Then I think we're at the end of our agenda. Unless Alderman Fleming, did you have any questions about the information on the Amita crisis line? You'd asked for.
Oh, yeah. So that there was a report in here. I guess my question is I guess Director Ike is on the phone who can answer this for me. So if I look at our contract, which is $145,000, trying to get to the right number here, it looks like, I guess if you can help me understand, so they provide 24-hour crisis line. If anyone can call them, variety of issues. Are they providing like ongoing therapeutic sessions for people?
Good day, everyone. This is Ike Ogbo, Director of Health and Human Services Department. Yes, they also provided a document that I attached, which illustrates all the services that they provided. On quarters, they submit quarterly reports that runs from January to March, then March to June, I believe. In those reports, it does highlight the number of activities that they performed. And as the contract stands, it is their responsibility to conduct those therapeutic or therapy sessions and counseling, mental health access, and if someone needs any type of hospitalization, that they provide such services. So from the beginning of the contract, this is something that they have been providing. And I believe someone from Amita is on the line. I can defer some of those questions to, so that they can get into the intricacies of the therapy that they provide or the counseling that they provide. Is anyone from Amita online?
Yes, I'm on here. It's Cindy Castro. I'm the manager of the outpatient clinic. We do provide ongoing therapy. So we do some of it at the library, but then we also do some separately. So this comes through like referrals that we get through the city, or just what we would consider like frequent flyers. Somebody gets identified and agreed with this community support. Then we do the ongoing. I think I had mentioned in a previous meeting here where I've been working with one of my clients since pretty much like the first year of the contract. So I've been seeing him like every other week through this contract, because otherwise he would not be able to afford services, or would probably continue calling 911. So we do offer those. We offer, a lot of case management, or even really assessment, and then try to link them to the appropriate service, because it might not be us. It might be a more intensive service. So then we would then partner up with like Trilogy, Peer Services, and refer them to them. We also work very closely with our connections with homeless and trying to make those connections there.
Okay, and so what is your capacity? You know, I assume it's a 24-hour line, and so if I call and I get you, Cindy, and I'm in crisis, maybe I only want to talk to you. So is it set up that I could just kind of be on your caseload for this duration of 6 years, and then kind of what is
So
it?
not for the crisis line. So the crisis line is separate, right? So anybody can call the 24-hour crisis line and get that immediate support. For ongoing, in terms of you getting on the caseload, that's separately. That's what I would handle, or what my staff would handle at the clinic. So this is pre-COVID. We would do home visits. So we might do a regular therapy session at somebody's home or at Starbucks, or they're more than welcome to come to our clinic, whatever feels comfortable for them. I don't think we really ever had like a capacity type of thing, because a lot of the individuals that we get are very chronic, and they sometimes just kind of like either go to a different service or they stay with us. I have a couple, we were up to a point that I was using 3 of my staff to do these services, depending on where we were at. But that's why I think I see it more as a triage, and then we keep the ones that just can't go anywhere else or are just not ready to go to another service, because we also get those where it's a very chronic client where they're just not in acceptance of their mental illness, so they would never go to another agency. But because we present ourselves as kind of like a community support, and we're here to help you out in any way that we can, and they don't see it as an official therapy session.
Okay, and so then my other question is, looking at the report that you give to CDBG, it looks like you had, let's see, from January till the end of June this year, 53 new Evanston calls, 5 continuing, and then 191 at the library, which I imagine can just be one quick question or kind of a more long-standing issue. But the Mental Health Advisory Committee, which I think you're on for the Mayor's Task Force, or probably someone from MEDA is on, also reports some numbers here. And so my first question is, do they have to identify where they're from when they call you all?
So for us to track them on our crisis line, it is an anonymous line, so they would have to self-identify as an Evanston resident in order for us to be able to track it that way. So we might get a lot of calls from Evanston residents, and we just don't have that documentation because we don't ask for that. We want people to feel comfortable when calling, so it's not a requirement for them to disclose that information.
Okay, and so before we have this contract in place, since people don't have to identify, did we have Evanston people who are calling and using the line?
What, people calling and using the line?
Yeah, so if we're paying for this service to be available for our Evanston residents, yet you don't have to identify to use the service. So I'm trying to think about it from a budgetary standpoint. Before we had the contract, were people just able to call and use the service anyway, just as a service of AMITA?
Right. I can't really speak to when the contract was initiated, which was in 2013. I can speak to a couple of years ago when I was in charge of the contract. And as you know, pre-COVID-19, we had our MEDA social workers at the library where, of course, information pertaining to one's residence is asked. And if you go down that list, you also see individuals who are non-Evanstonians. And these are individuals who we provided some type of help, who are perhaps homeless with an unknown residence. And of course, given that we are located at the library, some of our employees, they do participate in the program as well. As far as the 24-hour crisis line, it is something that we are continuing to take a look at, so that we can tally the number of Evanston residents who we are helping through that line. And as you know, that line is an anonymous line too. So it is kind of hard to streamline exactly how many Evanston residents who are calling that line. But as far as we know, over 70 individuals have used that line who identified themselves as Evanston residents during this period.
Okay, well, I would love to, I guess, get a better understanding. So if the line is functioning and it's just a service of AMITA as a community benefit, to the community they serve, because I think when I looked on the Turning Point website, there also list AMITA as this 24-hour line as an option, I think when their living room program is closed. And And so I guess
we have a contract. We have a contract with Turning Point, so we provide the after-hour line for them.
Service for them. Okay. Yeah. So I guess I'll think some more of what I've looked into here. I guess if you don't have to identify, I want the service to be available for Evanston residents, but I'm trying to just really figure out how our dollars are being utilized. If anyone can pick up the phone and call, that's great. But to make sure that, as we're paying, that our citizens are, being fully serviced, I guess is the
I think the attached to that too, when it came into the contract, was that if they would call the crisis line, they do identify, they do get this program offered. So then we would get the follow-up of it. So then our crisis workers would get their information and they'll pass it along to our clinic. So that was that extra step that was also covered through the contract.
Okay. And then I
would get the direct referral from the crisis line once they agree, right? And they give consent, then I would get the information of that identified themselves as a resident. They wanted to be a part of this program, and then we would do the follow-up within 24 to 48 hours. We'll do that, kind of warm handoff, or we would follow up either by phone or with a visit on continuing those services.
Okay. And then my last question is, if you had to estimate for me, how often are you all getting a call that then in turn you have to call the police for?
Well, that might be I have Sybil also on this Zoom, and she's actually the manager of the crisis line. So I manage the clinic and she's the manager. So she might be able to give you that information. Sybil, can you jump on?
Hi, yes, this is Sybil. I don't know offhand how many times we've had to call the police for a call. I could go back and look at that data by looking at the actual documentation for each of the calls, because typically when we are doing the tracking, we're counting the calls and not necessarily going in the note itself to see if the police had been called. But as the manager, I am available to the staff. Are any questions? And I can say that I don't recall right now of staff calling and asking for consultation if police should be called for a resident.
Okay. Well, as we talk about this conversation and our alternatives to policing, I would imagine some people who might be calling you would fall under this category where maybe they need services coming to their house. So it would be if you have the chance, or if it's information that's accessible, I would love to have an idea of how often you all are getting calls in which you're then calling the police to go out, because obviously we want to move those people to another service, which we'd make you aware of whenever we get it up and running. But I think that would be good information for us to know if our service, if we have a gap there, even as we have this crisis line available.
Yes, and I can definitely look into that and get back to you about that. I also did want to mention about agencies having a contract with our crisis line, is that in turn, people have been able to apply for grants by saying that they have access to a 24-hour crisis line. And I know I had been working with somebody from a while back regarding a grant specifically that was connected to things. Cindy probably knows more because they just need details of the crisis line, because one of the criteria was that there was access to a 24-hour crisis.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the crisis line, it's almost like if you look at the contract, because technically you can see it as like a bonus to the program. So it's not that the funding is directly going to the crisis line. The funding is going to the workers that are providing the services at the library, and also us doing the community support. So the crisis line is just like a bonus to all of this. So like if I'm being transparent, the money is not actually going to Sybil's crisis line that she manages, is going to the workers that are actually doing the work. So if you can see it that way as well. I know that now recently it's been promoted a little bit more. They have it on the Evanston Care Network. And I think that we're working on, and with Audrey, in terms of putting the crisis line as a prompt when they call 311, for people to be able to call 311 and then be able to have access to the crisis line. So I'm not sure where that's at this point, but that's also something that, it's in the works.
Yeah, that might be something good. But speaking about back to the library, if you can, Cindy, ask the library social worker if she's also able to pull together any kind of numbers around when she has to engage the police, right? If she's speaking to someone in the library and then she has to then call the police because of whatever reason, that would be helpful.
Oh yeah, I can get that. And it's probably been, maybe I supervise her. So I think we've had, it hasn't even been her calling. I think because a lot of the times we partner with the security at the library. So it's then at that point, sometimes the security is called to call the police. So I want to say if it was just Christina calling the police, it might have been just once, but I'll double check and get that information for you.
Okay, perfect. And then my last question is, Ike, do we share this cost with the library or is it just the city cost?
No, we share with the library. Health and Human Services shares it with the library. They pay a portion of it, we pay a portion of it.
All right, thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, committee. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, aye. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you
Thank you.
next week, I guess.